Hello, and welcome to the first of several presentations centered around how carbohydrate reduction can be of benefit to a number of health conditions. My first presentation is entitled, How Did the Developed World Get So Fat and So Sick? I am Dr. Marcus Hawkins. I'm a general practitioner here in Auckland, New Zealand. I've been a GP for about 22 years, and prior to that, I worked in hospital in both intensive care and general medicine. Now, it may surprise many to learn that 35 years ago, when I was at medical school, I received no nutrition education whatsoever. And it is my understanding that this is still the case in many medical schools around the world today. Over the last 10 years, I've begun to realize just how incredibly important nutrition is to human health. Better late than never, one might say. Nutrition can certainly determine good health, but also lead to sickness and disease, which we call morbidity, or even death, which we term mortality. I would also argue that the recent nutritional advice of the last 50 years or so has adversely impacted healthcare systems around the world, led to more overweight, obesity, disease, and premature death. So what is the problem that we face? Well, when we look at the evolution of man, we can see man starting as a primitive ape, Australopithecus, and then developing up to the tallest character in this diagram, Homo sapiens. And then in the last several hundred years, arguably, man has started to gain weight. So we've seen a rise in obesity, and with obesity comes a condition called insulin resistance, which we'll talk about a little later on. So what is the scale of the problem? Well, according to the World Health Organization, worldwide, obesity has nearly tripled since 1975. Looking at some of the statistics, unfortunately, I cannot compare year with year, but just give certain statistics which are, in their own right, quite compelling. So in 2016, 39% of adults were overweight and 13% were obese. There were over 340 million children and adolescents who were overweight or obese. In 2020, 39 million children under the age of 5 were overweight or obese. It is sad to note that most of the world's population now live in countries where being overweight or obese kills more people than being underweight does. What about closer to home? Well, in this next slide, which I call the fattening of New Zealand 1977 to 2012, you can see why. In this graph produced by the Ministry of Health, in 1977, only 10% of the population were obese. In 2012, it is touching 30%. And that is 11 years ago. So the data we have now indicates we're at least 30%. And this coincides quite nicely with the introduction of the low-fat diet in 1977. This was the recommendation not only in New Zealand but in America and the United Kingdom and various other countries, and they've also seen the same rise in obesity. Here are some more New Zealand statistics. According to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, New Zealand adults are the third most obese in this organisation. 1 in 3 New Zealand children are overweight or obese. In 2021, the Ministry of Health undertook a survey which found that 12.5% of children aged between 2 and 14 years were obese. The year before, this figure was only 9.5%. We know that obesity tends to differ by ethnicity. In particular, Pacific and Maori people are more prone. And we also know that children living in the most socio-economically deprived areas were 2.5 times as likely to be obese as children living in the least deprived areas. Again, these children tend to be Pacific Island and Maori. So what about global adult overweight and obesity? Here's some more data from the OECD, which looks at overweight, which includes obesity, in a number of different countries over time. And you will recognise that all countries are shown to increase their obesity and overweight rates in the time they've been measured. What is particularly interesting is the fact that the United States shows a clear and linear progression in obesity rates from approximately 1977 onwards. And this mirrors what I was saying previously about the rates of increased obesity in New Zealand and other countries around the world. And this message is again reflected in this data from the WHO, where you can see numerous countries all increasing obesity rates between 1975 and 2016. So what about global childhood overweight and obesity? Well, here's some data from an article in the British journal The Lancet, which estimates the percentage of children who are overweight and obese in a selection of countries. And you can see between 1974 and approximately 2005 in all the selected countries, there is an increase in overweight and obesity. So how did the developed world get so fat? Well, I lay the blame squarely at the feet of this man. His name is Ancel Keys, and he was an American physiologist and researcher. In 1956, he initiated the 7-country study. This was multinational, involving 12,700 middle-aged men living in rural communities in Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, Finland, Japan, Netherlands, and the United States. And it indeed suggested an association between cholesterol and heart disease. However, there were some significant design flaws in that there was minimal data taken from each country. They employed food recall questionnaires which are notoriously inaccurate, and he was accused of cherry picking. This was also what we call an epidemiological study, which can only ever show an association, not causation. In other words, there was no proof. It was, however, regarded as a landmark study. So now on to the diet, heart hypothesis and more. This was based on Ancel Keys' theory that increased saturated fat in the diet, namely animal fat, increased blood cholesterol, and this led to heart attacks and some strokes. In 1961, the American Heart Association stated that the best scientific evidence of the time strongly suggests Americans reduce their risk of heart disease by reducing saturated fat. Now, this opinion really was driven by personalities and connections. The strongest personality was Ancel Keys, and he had significant connections in the American Heart Association, such that his opinion was essentially adopted as gospel. In 1977, the United States Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs came out with its dietary goals for the American people. And it stated that the current diet was excessively rich in meat and other sources of saturated fat and cholesterol, and that this was linked to heart disease, some cancers, diabetes, and obesity. And people were advised to reduce total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, sugar, and salt, and increase carbohydrates. Now, it must be noted that this was also driven by political expediency. Senator John McGovern, who was in charge of the committee, declined to await further science and scientific review of the literature to know whether or not cholesterol was indeed the culprit in heart disease and strokes. So it went forward regardless of the science. So in 1984, further fuel was given to the fire by the Lipid Research Clinic's primary prevention trial, which compared lowering cholesterol with diet plus drugs versus diet alone. This was a drug trial testing if the drug would work, and indeed the conclusion was that drugs can lower risk of coronary heart disease, such that the National Institutes of Health in America proclaimed there is no doubt that a low-fat diet will afford significant protection against coronary heart disease to every American over the age of 2. So because they could lower heart disease by using drugs, they came to the same conclusion that you could lower heart disease by lowering cholesterol. But can you really say that? In 1992, the United States Department of Agriculture came out with its food pyramid, and this spread across continents and has been adopted by many countries and authorities. The final outcome was to advocate reducing fat and to replace fat with carbohydrates. So here we have the so-called healthy food pyramid. So at the top, we have fats and oils, salt, sugar, and alcohol to be consumed the least, working our way down, lean meat, fish, poultry, beans, nuts, eggs, milk, yogurt, and cheese, a little bit more of those, and at the bottom, forming the bulk of what one should be eating: breads, cereals, fruits, and vegetables. Now, what's interesting about the food pyramid, it was originally designed or came out of the United States Department of Agriculture. And I just find that as a really odd situation where the agricultural part of society determines what people should be eating for their health. Surely the agriculturalists and farmers have the most to gain by selling their products. But are their products necessarily the most healthy? And are they most healthy in this proportion? That is the question, and a question we shall be looking at in due course. So now we come on to the consequences of reduced fat in the diet and increased carbohydrates, namely obesity and insulin resistance. I will talk more about insulin resistance shortly. But with insulin resistance comes pre-diabetes eventually morphing into diabetes. And once you get the diagnosis of diabetes, then you are at increased risk of heart disease, stroke, kidney failure, blindness, amputations, etc. Also driven by insulin resistance can be high blood pressure, and if left unchecked, will also lead to heart attacks, heart failure, and strokes, in other words, brain hemorrhages. Insulin resistance is also associated with fatty liver disease, that is, excessive fat stored within the liver. Now, over a long time, this can result in liver scarring, otherwise known as cirrhosis, and long-standing cirrhosis can result in liver cancer. And finally, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a state of infertility in young women, is usually associated with obesity and numerous cysts on the ovaries. This is again attributable to insulin resistance. So what is insulin resistance? Well, bread, pasta, potatoes, rice and fruit are all foodstuffs which contain multiple molecules of glucose. And they can be called sugar, starch, carbs, but they're all consisting of multiple glucose molecules. When ingested, they're broken down to glucose. And glucose stimulates insulin to store glucose as glycogen in the liver and muscles first, and then as fat when the glycogen stores are full in the liver and various locations around the body. Now, we routinely eat much more glucose than we can use on a daily basis, and so glycogen stores rapidly fill up. Excess glucose is then converted to fat by insulin, the fat storage hormone. With chronic demand, insulin fails to work properly and more is required to put glucose into storage as glycogen or fat, and this is insulin resistance. Eventually, even very high insulin levels become ineffective at regulating glucose, and so prediabetes and then diabetes follow. Chronically raised glucose causes blood vessel inflammation and eventually damage. So where is the problem heading? Rather than referring to the evolution of man, I now talk about the devolution of man. And you can see how man is developing on from a magnificent creation, for want of a better word, of Homo sapiens. I call modern man Homo adiposus, Homo for mankind, adiposus for fat. And in addition to this, endless dollars to be spent on illness and complications of illness and obesity, and more premature death. So in summary, the problem is obesity and its related disorders which have arisen out of good intention but have led to significant and unintended consequences. Insulin resistance would appear to be the main mechanism responsible for the disorders arising out of obesity and leading to blood vessel damage. And obesity is increasing exponentially and is becoming economically unsustainable. What can we do about it? So what can we do about it? Here are some thoughts. We can reflect on the global trend of the last 50 years and ask some very hard questions. Did we get it wrong? Are we on the right track? And where to now? There needs to be political will and input for change to happen on a national scale. Agencies resisting change include Big Food and Big Pharma. Big Food likes us to eat food that's rapidly digested and keeps us hungry for more. Big Pharma likes to have us reliant on their medications, which are arising out of eating food that makes us overweight and fat and sick. Both parties stand to benefit from this ongoing state of affairs. So any suggestions, please forward them. So I thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope it's been useful. Please feel free to send any questions or suggestions to me, and I look forward to hearing from you and presenting to you again in the near future. Thank you.